Hi, and welcome to Things Education's TE Present Teacher. And here today in episode 5, we are going to talk about something that is very near and dear for all teachers. Teachers want to try out different things, they want to experiment with their classes. But hey, who's got the time? There's a syllabus to complete, there's a curriculum to complete, there are annual days, etc. happening. So, how do we help them figure out what is important, what needs to be done in the classroom, what can be given for homework or self work? So, to discuss all of these things, we have Ritu here today. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
So, like I said in the introduction, Ritu, there are these हजार expectations from teachers that there is a syllabus to complete, there's limited time. There are these extracurricular activities that you are going to manage, you are going to kind of organize. I mean, come on, Independence Day is going to come up, so there's going to be some event for that. There's going to be Diwali celebrations, Christmas celebration, etc., etc. And then there are annual day sports days. So there is limited time for teachers, and teachers, we have met teachers who have this immensely positive outlook of, yes, I want to try out these new things. But time kiske paas hai? Or who's got the time? So I get that they are on this treadmill once the students come in at the beginning of the academic year. Is your experience kind of similar?
Yeah, one, just completing the syllabus is so much. The textbooks are so huge, exam pressure is so high. Completing the syllabus in itself is the biggest challenge. And adding everything that you said with responsibilities for extracurricular, responsibilities for administrative work. Um, Teachers are always pressed for time, and especially now after EP 2020 has made 50 hours of TPD compulsory and uh, asking teachers to use different pedagogies to teach. There's just absolutely no time that teachers now have in trying to manage all of it.
Right. And just to be clear, we're not dissing all of these other things like TPD or all the extracurricular activities. It's just we're trying to highlight that it's very difficult for teachers to even have time to think, let alone do things in the classroom. Okay, so let's just now focus on the classroom itself. Even within the classroom, there's this paucity of time where you have limited time and there is a syllabus that needs to be complete. And now that you mentioned NEP 2020, it also recommends that we reduce the burden on students by focusing on only the required LOs or important LOs. Okay. So, how does one go about doing that? What is required LOs? What is important LOs? We'll get to that in a bit. But I just wanted to understand that whenever we started talking about this conversation, and we have done this seamlessly, we've kind of already started talking about LOs or learning outcomes. Um, why did that happen? I mean, it happened for me, it happened subconsciously. Can you just put some light on what the thought process could have been?
I think learning outcomes are the starting point of anything, whether you're deciding what you want to teach, what you want to assess, what students need to learn, or you're deciding what logical approach to use. Learning outcomes become the starting point for everything. And I think another factor may be that just because of the work we do and the kind of resources that we create for teachers, the learning outcomes that we are seeing are very, very specific, very, very focused. And so being able to use learning outcomes as the starting point for any decision has now sort of become a second nature. Um, and what the NEP has suggested is makes complete sense that to reduce burden on students, focus only on important LOs makes complete sense in that context.
On one hand, I understand that NEP is suggesting that we reduce the burden on students and focus on some specific LOs, learning outcomes. Um, but I mean, if I think about it as a teacher, if I have to cover the entire syllabus, say I have 100 learning outcomes to meet. Uh, so if I have to finish the syllabus, right? There's no going back on that. So the 100 learning outcomes remain the same. And at the same time, I'm supposed to reduce the burden on the students by prioritizing my learning outcomes. So that kind of becomes a conundrum for the teacher. And I just wanted to explore that a little as to how we go about, you know, doing this.
So, yes, the more specific the LOs, the more specific the learning outcomes, the more the number. And on the other hand, uh, we're saying that this helps reduce burden on students and helps you prioritize. So, I think the way to look at this is that the more specific the learning outcomes, the easier it is to see what needs to be prioritized. And I think this is a good place to start. Maybe let us introduce um, how we've thought about this process of prioritizing and the quadrant of time versus learning outcomes.
Right. So, okay, so here's how I think about it. Um, let's just look at learning outcomes, okay? Learning outcomes can be of different kinds. There are learning outcomes that are based in understanding the core of the subject, uh, or essentially, let's just put it this way: learning outcomes that are useful when achieved by the students. And I'm just saying useful right now. We'll try to define this, what this useful is. And then on the other hand, is learning outcomes that are not very useful, even if mastered or understood by the students. Okay, so that let's just call that one axis. Say the vertical axis is that. The horizontal axis is time taken by the students to understand that learning outcome. Okay, so there are some learning outcomes that take time for the students to understand the nuance of it, to grasp it, etc. And on the other hand, some learning outcomes take very little time to kind of for the students to understand it. Um, so then what we get is if we kind of look at it as an XY uh, graph, we can have four different areas in the graph. Um, One where the learning outcome is extremely useful and it takes almost no time for the students to understand it. Or and then similarly, there you can see that there can be some learning outcomes which are useful and take a lot of time for the students to understand. And then there is this area which is learning outcomes are not very useful, but students can understand it very quickly. And then the last part, which is the learning outcomes are very useful, sorry, not very useful, but takes a long time for the students to understand. So if you can break down learning outcomes this way, maybe it will help in prioritizing.
Yeah. So, usefulness of learning outcomes, which we'll discuss what that means. And of course, time being a very important factor because here we're talking about how do we fit everything into the limited time that teachers have. So I think that's a very useful way of looking at it. And we also found that teachers have found it very valuable to start thinking about this graph when they're planning their year.
Okay, so let's just first focus on the two different axes that I mentioned. Let's start with time because I think that is the simpler one to talk about. Um, Time taken to understand something. Now, in my experience, teachers kind of get this intuitively that this topic they're going to quickly figure out. This topic, oh no, I need to spend some time talking about this. Um, how does it work for you? Can we have some examples of time taken to understand something?
So something that takes not much time to understand. So let's start as always with the learning outcome. And probably my favorite topic area, that is grammar. Um, a learning outcome that comes to mind is students will be able to understand the rules of converting an active voice sentence into a passive voice sentence. So again, we want students to understand the rules. And a good way of doing that is with some explaining the rules and then doing some examples. This is actually a pretty straightforward thing. And understanding the rules is not something that's going to take too much time.
So that would be a learning outcome which doesn't take time for students to understand or master the understanding part of it. And I'm
Yeah.
kind of guessing that there is something else also, because understanding is one thing. Like I'm thinking of long division now in my head. Whenever you say grammar, I start thinking math. Okay, so there are some parallels there in my head for some reason at least. Mm. So with long division also, I understand that okay, I can understand. I can quickly make the students understand what the steps of the process are and a little bit of how it works and why it works. And that is not going to take too much time for the students to understand. Maybe one class, that's it. And I'm pretty sure the students understand what needs to be done. But when I'm thinking of that, I'm also thinking that, hey, there's still going to be errors while they're doing this. So I'm guessing there's a different learning outcome for the practice of what you just said, because that's how I'm thinking about it for learning long division.
Yeah, yeah. So understanding the rules is one learning outcome. The next logical step is applying those rules and practicing them. So students will be able to actually convert an active voice sentence to a passive voice sentence is a different learning outcome.
Right,
And that, of course, is going to take more time.
right,
So on that axis, it's going to be further down in terms of the time taken for
right,
students to achieve this learning outcome.
right. Okay. So I know we have taken some time to, kind of discuss this. Um, but honestly, this part comes very intuitively to teachers. They kind of know, what is going to take me time and what is not going to take students time to understand. And it's really nice when you don't even have to go into the nuances of that. So just keeping with that, we'll not go into the nuances of time taken to understand, but we'll focus on the other axis, the vertical axis in our model, which is usefulness when understood. That okay, some things are okay when they are, I mean, they take less time, but how useful are they? Or something takes less time, but how, uh, if they're not useful, what's the point? Sometimes. Okay, so let's just continue with this example of what you had said, the two learning outcomes regarding active and passive voice. So, how would you rate them on the scale of usefulness?
Just to answer your question directly, uh, is it useful when students know how to convert active voice to passive voice, or is it useful when they are able to apply those rules and actually convert them? Uh, Absolutely, because that makes writing so much more fluent and so much more effective and makes communication so much better. Um, it's a very important skill to have, whether you're writing in a formal way, an informal way, creatively, descriptively, whatever it is. In terms of usefulness for real life communication, and for fluency, I think it's a very high priority learning outcome.
Okay, so I think from there we can kind of derive what this vertical axis actually means. When we say something is useful, what you kind of alluded to was that if some learning outcome is going to help students for a long term, beyond their school, beyond their classroom, maybe that is one trait of a learning outcome being useful. Is that okay to say?
Yeah, finally, that's the aim, right? Students should be able to apply all of these learnings to their real life and just be successful human beings. That's a good way of judging whether a learning outcome is useful and important.
Okay. Are there any other traits for calling a learning outcome useful?
I think one more trait is this learning outcome going to help students further on in that same topic or in that same subject? Is this a foundational learning outcome which, sort of builds the basic understanding that they need in order to continue understanding further topics in the subject, maybe in the same grade, maybe even in higher grades.
Right. So, I mean, then I can think of the simplest example could be, addition. If students are able to understand what addition is, are able to do addition, every other mathematical operation stems from addition. Subtraction is basically negative addition, multiplication is repeated addition, and so on. So that's the kind of thing you're talking about, right? I mean, and at some level, it might even go on to, I mean, the whole of mathematics is kind of mathematical operations, algebra, trigonometry, etc., has basis in mathematical operations. So then all mathematical operations become useful. Is that how I would think about it?
Yeah, and another example at that level is anything that you do in foundational reading.
Right.
Um, Knowing how to read, just read fluently, not comprehend, just read fluently is so basic and so important for any other skill in language. Because if you're not able to read, you can't read science, maths, EVS, nothing else. You're going to struggle everywhere. So, and I think foundational years teachers definitely know this, and they're very aware that what they're doing is going to uh, affect their students for the rest of their life almost.
Right.
Mm. The slight more difficulty in understanding this trait comes in higher grades, where teachers have to then decide what is foundational in a at a grade six level, what is a foundational LO or foundational learning outcome. That is where some struggle might happen.
And here you mean foundation as in basic, something that forms a base of something,
Basic.
right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Just wanted to clarify that because we are using foundation in two different ways. So can we have an example of this? I mean, say you were off air. We were just talking about this incident with chemistry. So can you just share that? I think that was a very good example for this in this situation.
Yeah. So weirdly enough, I've taught chemistry a few times to students. I've got a lot of help, and I think the way I was taught these topics by you and by others in the team uh, really goes to the core of what foundational is at that level. And I'll explain that. So we were doing a course on sustainability with grade six and grade seven students in a school in Dehradun a few years back. And for them to understand sustainability, we wanted them to understand why plastic does not break down, why it takes so long for any plastic product to break down. And to understand that, we wanted them to understand the chemistry or the chemical structure of plastic. To understand the chemical structure of plastic, wanted to start with what atoms are, how these carbon molecules are structured in plastic. Students were really struggling with just the basics of chemistry. And so what we ended up doing is going down to the structure about how electrons in the outermost orbit of atoms are shared between different atoms, and that's how carbon molecules are. Students still, I mean, it's difficult. It's an abstract concept. You can't really imagine it. So what we ended up doing was forming circles on the board and giving them pieces of clay to use as electrons and getting them to then create these carbon molecules using clay and very physical things. And I remember this one point in the classroom where a lot of students went like, "Oh, this is what it means." And when they finally got it and they started creating their own molecules, it was really fun and they were really excited about it. A lot of kids came and said at that point that, "Oh, this is the first time I'm actually understanding what this means."
Tell me something though. You said grades 6 and 7, right? We
Mhm.
should already have known this by this time, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's where we were confused because we didn't plan to go down to such. Wanted them to think about the structure of plastic, not really the structure of atoms. And the class teacher happened to be sitting in on all of these classes, and
Yeah.
uh, she came up to me with a concern, and she said, "Look, I'm so happy that my students are understanding it, and they're so excited about chemistry because it makes my work with them so much easier now. But she told me that Ritu, you spent about 2, 3 hours doing just this with them. I don't have that kind of time. I would have done this with them, but the responsibilities of the syllabus and the everything that I have to do in school doesn't allow me this kind of time. So, uh, and she just wanted to know what she could do. And I think this was such a great example of a foundational or a basic important learning outcome at a grade 6 or a grade 7 level, depending on what board you're teaching in. I spoke to her at that point about, you know what, I think it would be completely okay for you to spend these 2, 3 hours over a week, over 2 weeks, just teaching your students about these basic things. Because once they get this, a lot of your chapters, a lot of your topics become so much simpler to teach. That the time that you would have spent teaching those deeply gets spent teaching this basic structure of an atom, and you're going to go quicker. In fact, once students have this knowledge.
Right. So, I think from what you're saying, I understand that, okay, one is that it's a foundational or a basic uh, thing that the students need to understand. Because everything else is going to be based on that, right? Your chemical reactions, balancing them, figuring out how compounds are made, what is the chemical formula for the compounds. I don't need to cram those. I don't need to memorize those. If I know uh, how bonds are formed, how atoms come together to form bonds and make these molecules. So yeah, I mean, and I would say that, you can go down to a more basic level and just say that, hey, if I understand classification of elements and how the modern periodic table has come up and how electrons are filled in their uh, orbitals for each of these elements, then that's it. So I get what you're saying, and that's a great example. So I think that that also brings us to another point, which is that there is certain amount of I mean, you kind of prioritize this learning outcome, right? When you did this, and you said that I'm going to spend this much time because this is a high priority learning outcome for me. And once this is prioritized, I can actually deprioritize other learning outcomes. I don't need to spend that much time with the students for the students to get it. So yeah, I think that's a great example for that.
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project based or inquiry based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
Okay, so I get what you're saying in the sense of when we're talking about prioritizing learning outcomes, we might need to go down to understanding what is the basic or the foundational learning for, building on other topics, on which other topics can be built. Um, and so that would be a useful learning outcome. And then if I'm a teacher, I should be prioritizing that useful learning outcome. And by prioritizing, I mean by that I'm going to spend some more time on that with the students. Okay, that's good to know. And I think one more point that kind of came out from what you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it also, when you give this example of, you know, how compounds are formed, how chemical bonds are formed, it also goes down to the core of the subject. If I want to talk to students about, what are the fundamentals of a subject, I'll take a different example from what you did. Like essentially, understanding motion. So speed, velocity, acceleration. Those are the core of physics as a subject in school. So, these are the kind of topics that I would, or specific learning outcomes from these topics, which I would prioritize or call them useful. And hence, prioritize them higher. Mm. So can we have a couple of examples or some examples from say language or social sciences as well?
I think in language, of course, the learning outcomes that go to the core of the subject are, um, when it comes to comprehension, it's the elements of a story, or elements of any text, depending on its genre.
Right.
um, it's good to, I mean, of course, we have to enjoy stories as they are. And if you're reading science fiction, you should be able to enjoy the story and like it. That is definitely important. And uh, there has to be focus on that as well, not just learning or memorizing facts from the story. But I think something that goes to the core of reading comprehension is understanding the uh, how a text is structured. Science fiction is usually um, a story that is based in the future or is based on some scientific invention that does still exist. But that doesn't really change basic human emotions and basic human motivations. Human beings don't change. The environment around them changes because of a scientific invention.
Right.
And keeping those sort of elements of a genre in mind just helps us understand the story so much better and helps us also become better writers. Um, so I think right from the beginning, right from kindergarten, having some focus on this, this kind of learning outcome about elements of text, elements of different genres, in fact, um, is foundational, and it should be something that should be done with every text we do, um, and introducing kids to words, to technical terms like characters, settings, events, plot, which is really, it's not really done in a very widespread manner, but I think goes to the core of language.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, when I asked you the question, also my answer to that was understanding different genres of reading slash writing. Because, like you said, structure is different, elements are different, and understanding the nuances help definitely help you in writing. But the only way you're going to be able to do that is understanding it while you're reading. Yeah, that's it's a great point. Thanks. So now we have these two axes where we have defined what usefulness is. I don't think we can go more nuanced than this, that, it needs to be basic, it needs to be at the core of the subject. Um, and it is something that, students can build upon. So based on this, I can say that, okay, some things are going to be used, some learning outcomes are useful, some learning outcomes are not so useful. I'm not going to say that they're useless, and that's a major point, and I'm going to underline it and say it. I'm not saying that there are learning outcomes that are not useful at all. I'm just saying that some learning outcomes are just more useful than others when they are understood by the students. Um, so then I would say that, going back to our model, I would say that learning outcomes that are very useful and do not take up too much time for the students to understand or master, mm, would be my highest priority, right? Because it will help me with the time element as well as a teacher. And the students will get something useful out of it. Okay. Uh, and then there would be obviously the one that is useful but takes time. The learning outcomes that are useful but take a little bit of time. And then we have something that won't take a lot of time but is not really very useful, or is has a lower usefulness. And finally, something that is not very useful and takes a lot of time would be like the lowest priority for me as a teacher. Right. So, I mean, if that is the model, and we have this model in front of us, um, okay, now let's just do a little bit of a conversation on how we approach all of these four uh, groups when it comes to actually teaching or interacting with the students. Um, And for that, I'm just going to put this out there as a in in math we have this rule that cannot be changed, is what we spoke about right at the beginning. The time that teachers have is limited. And I'm just going to break it down further and say that the time that teachers have with their students in the classroom is limited. And that is the most precious commodity that we are trying to, uh, prioritize for. But if I have so much time, if this is what I want to talk to my students about, what is that going to be? So we'll just keep that as a thing at the back of our mind for the while we are going through these examples, if we can come up with examples for this. Um, so yeah, so let's do the most straightforward one first. Something that is very useful, but will definitely take some time for the students to understand. And I'm going to help you out here in the sense of we've already spoken about that, like the example that you gave for from the school in the north of India, um, where it did take you time, and the teacher also recognized that hey, I can also do this, but it will take me time. Uh, so can you just tell a little bit about why it is important to do that, even if it's taking you time?
Right. So we're talking about the chemistry example here, and how atoms share electrons. I'm going to go back to when I was in school. I struggled a lot with chemistry and with other science subjects, and I think where my struggle came from was not understanding these basics, especially when it came to how different elements come together. I'm sorry if I word, how different elements come together to form a compound, or how equations are balanced. Is that a thing in chemistry that we did?
Yeah.
We had to balance some equations. For me, a lot of it was just rote learning. I had to rote memorize it. Of course, during exams, I forgot, and I didn't do very well on those subjects because I just couldn't remember these complicated things. Mm. And when I understood this as an adult, when I actually understood how atoms share electrons, it became so much easier for me that I could teach it. Um, and I think that's this understand if teachers have to go through different the chapters that they're going to go in that they're going to do in their year, and talk to teachers of higher grades about what's going to happen further on. I think collectively they can decide that these are some topics that if our students don't understand, they're going to struggle in every grade and in every chapter. And
Right.
I think subject teachers know that, like, they're the best people to decide this. Subject teachers.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you on that. And so that would actually then tell me that I should talk to my teachers, talk to my colleagues, and then come up with these, fundamental learning outcomes at different grade levels, and then work with students on those fundamental and make sure that my lesson planning or my planning for the year is such that I have kept enough time for the students to kind of get these learning outcomes out of the way well. Out of the way as in the students have met the learning outcomes and they've met them well. Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so let's talk about the other quadrant now, which is high usefulness when understood and takes up very little time for the students to understand it. So that is obviously a no-brainer for teachers to do it in the classroom, spend a little bit of time with the students so that they have this quick leap to the understanding uh, of that learning outcome. So I would prioritize that the highest, in terms of, especially given that hey, it's not going to take me too much time, and students are going to benefit a lot from it.
So immediately, I think two examples come to mind. One is an example that we just discussed about features of different genres. It'll probably take a teacher 5 minutes at the beginning of a lesson to run through these features with their students, and going ahead maybe 5 minutes at the end of class once they've done that sort of genre a few times. 5 minutes at the end of class to ask students So what were the features? Did you notice the features? It's so quick, but it's so essential to have that discussion. And it's going to make reading and writing so much more fun and so much more efficient. I think that's the first example that comes to mind. And um, the second example that we discussed when we're working with kindergarten teachers or foundational years teachers is doing phonics activities for at least 5 to 10 minutes every day, or doing fine motor activities with your youngest kids for 5 to 10 minutes every day. Just that much, if it's planned into your everyday teaching, is going to be very, very useful. Um, so yeah, those are the quick but very important learning outcomes for kids.
Right. And I think you've in the first example, I think it really resonated with me because, like you said, over a course of say 3 4 classes, I'm spending 5 7 minutes on that, and it's not only helping the reading skills, it's also helping my writing skills. So it's having a exponential effect. It's not going to just have a direct effect on one or two things. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, so let's go to now things that are not that useful when it's understood. And if it's taking a lot of time, I would not even want the teachers to spend their precious time with the students on that. Um, so, you know, I would, for example, want teachers to just ask students to read something by themselves. And I'll come up with an example this time, and you can tell me if that is making sense or not. Um, Essentially, I would say anything that I would want to memorize for the exam or the test. It could be anything, to be honest. Okay, and I'm not taking examples right now because our curriculum, the way it's structured, is littered with such things, and especially the way we are examined at the end of the year. So there are multiple things which are just that. Okay, you have to remember this. That's it. There's nothing else to this. Uh, so again, here I would not say that the teachers should not care about these learning outcomes, but they should be low priority in terms of how much time you spend with the students on these learning outcomes. So what are some things that teachers can do for such learning outcomes?
Um, so let me start with an example because I think that makes it a lot more concrete for me. This, I think, happens a lot in teaching of history, right? We ask students to memorize dates and names and places. And those are questions that are asked in the exam. So those are not learning outcomes that can be ignored. But what we're essentially asking students to then do is memorize these details uh, without really understanding why these names and places and dates are important. Um, so how do you then approach that? I think so. I'll take an example again of a history course we've done with students where we we used Animal Farm, which is based on the Russian Revolution, with students, and we really deeply understood the interactions between different people, the motivations, the history behind, how they grew up and what they learned and how their actions were affected by what was happening in the world around them. And this was done, of course, first in the context of this very easy to understand story of Animal Farm, and then we connected it to what actually happened in Russia in the Russian Revolution. Um, Students are automatically then curious about the the general dates because they wanted to understand what was happening in the world that affected, or why didn't others intervene, or what finally led to these circumstances. And they connected it to what was happening in India at that time, what was happening in whatever they've learned about the world was. Mm, and that sort of curiosity and learning happened automatically. We didn't want students to, we didn't ask students to memorize the dates in that case. But I think the point we're making here is that as long as students are able to understand the bigger context of those events, uh, it is okay to ask them to then memorize the dates and the specific details as homework, as worksheet practice that they do later. But our time with students needs to be spent on the core of history in this case, which is understanding the events and how they affect today.
Right. I think that's a great point. I think that also again goes back to the same point that we've been trying to make, that refocus on what is actually useful for students once they've understood something. Um, and just memorizing the dates or events or places or people names may not be that important in the context of what needs to be the focus. So, and when you have these lower priority learning outcomes, what you said was you can give them for homework and do a quick check if they have actually read about this or memorize these things uh, by doing giving them a worksheet and so on. Again, a small point that Ritu made, but I think that's important that don't neglect them. Have that worksheet check whether the students have actually memorized this, because eventually all of these things are going to lead to some marks in the exam, etc., etc. So even though they're lower priority learning outcomes, we are not saying that we you have to completely ignore them. We're just saying don't spend your precious time with the students on getting them to memorize something or you helping them memorize something. It's it is not a very probably not the best use of your limited time. And then from there, let's come to the last quadrant, mm, which is something that is not very useful when it's learned or understood, and it takes a long time. These definitely should be anything outside the class. Again, it could be homework, it could be, you know, go read it and come, and tomorrow you will be tested on it, or write a report, and that's it. Not just that's it. And then you'll see what the report says and figure out whether the students have understood it or not. But the point is that the time that you have with the students, don't spend too much on it. Is that okay to say? Ritu?
Yeah. So, mm, learning outcomes that don't really go to the core of learning and take a lot of time. Those are the ones that we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I think from our conversation over the last few minutes, what we've understood is that um, on one hand, we want to reduce the burden of students by making them focus on the high priority learning outcomes. We need to find a way to find these high priority learning outcomes. And then we kind of saw that how do we prioritize these learning outcomes? And we used a two-factor scale, which was one was how useful is it for the students once they understand something? And second is how much time are they taking to understand this? Uh, these two things, when you put them together, you kind of get four different scenarios where something is very useful when understood, but takes a lot of time to understand, or something is very useful when understood, doesn't take a lot of time. And similarly for learning outcomes that are low in their usefulness as compared to the others. Um, so once we have this, we also discussed about how do we approach learning outcomes in each of these areas. And yeah, I think this becomes crucial, especially at a point of time where we are looking to move away from textbooks. We are looking to move away from uh, concrete syllabuses, whatever the curricula, and have a general competency-based curriculum and have resources, whatever resources are available to teachers, students, etc. I think that is when it's going to become even more useful for teachers to figure out that, hey, out of all of this that can be done, we are not, we don't have to do everything. We don't have to talk to the students about everything. We don't actually have to cover the entire syllabus in the classroom with the students. It just needs to be covered in different ways. And being able to prioritize the learning outcomes will help them do that. Any last thoughts, Ritu, on this?
I mean, I think this is something that won't happen um, on the go, right? It's an exercise that teachers should start when they're in the planning stage, either in the summer vacations or even the Diwali or winter vacations, whichever is longer for teachers. When we're in the planning stage, that is where this needs to happen, and it needs to happen with other subject teachers and not in a silo because it finally affects everything going forward. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it needs to become a really important part of any teacher profession development and needs to be supported by school management as an exercise that teachers need to spend time on.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. So thanks a lot, Ritu. And thank you everyone for watching the Present Teacher by Things Education. If you like the video, please do like it, subscribe to us, do all those kinds of things. Comment. If you have questions, please feel free to comment and we will try to get back to you. In the meantime, I'm Aniruddh and thank you all for listening.